I've been retired now for about 25 years, but I worked as a marine and freshwater zoologist, and with several of my students I did quite a lot of work on fish. Some of the most interesting studies involved the ecology of species like dace and pike, and we used numbered implant tags to identify fish. We used miniature radio tags to track them, and we also used activity tags to study their behaviour. What I was asked to try and do today was to talk about bass, and as an experienced angler to say something about possible shifts in the stocks of these fish. You might think it'd be easy to ask other anglers how things have changed, but I'm afraid you'd find they're no better than anyone else, and they tend to think that what they're catching now is similar to what their fathers and grandfathers used to catch. So if asking the angler on the seashore isn't going to help us, is there any scientific way we can find out whether stocks of bass have changed over the years? Well, it would be nice if we had a continuous record of how many bass of each size and age were present in every year, but we don't have this. In fact, tasty fish like bass are affected by so many things, including angling and commercial fishing, that it's never going to tell us what we'd like to know. However, there are other species of fish which are long-lived and slow-growing like bass, and I've chosen a good example from my past experience to demonstrate. This information is actually taken from chub, which are not exploited, and just pretend that they're bass. The silhouettes might help. These 9 bar charts are real data, and the bars show how many fish of each size are present in a year's sample. I've picked out in brown age groups of fish which were born in good years, when lots of eggs were laid, lots of young survived, and the fish grew well. This is what we call a strong year class, and when they've grown up for several years, it may present us with a chance of catching a decent specimen. Good year classes like those I've just described tend to occur when we've had favourable weather, so although this may not happen very often, if conditions are suitable, lots of fish will survive and grow. However, we know that climate's also changing, and year on year the sea's getting warmer. In the 1950s and 60s, when I was living and fishing in the northeast of England, bass were as rare as hen's teeth up there, and in fact I never saw one, let alone caught one. In 1954, fisheries scientist Michael Kennedy wrote that the usual northern limits for bass were Lincolnshire in the east and the Mersey in the west. Bass shift as the water warms, and by the 21st century, my friends who were fishing in Northumberland and on the west coast of Scotland were catching lots of good-sized bass. With nothing other than the weather and climate change to think about, that's the sort of picture we get. Enter Homo sapiens, and now we have the depredations of angling and commercial fishing to consider. If it was just a matter of people catching fish on rod and line, I don't think there'd be a major problem, because if stocks declined, catches would diminish and fishing would decrease. In fact, if it was shore angling alone, virtually all the fish caught would be returned alive and well. In contrast to the catch and release habits of most shore-based anglers, commercial fishers using various types of nets land fish en masse, and they have little chance of selecting bycatch, including undersized bass, to be returned to the sea in good condition. Fixed nets can be and are set very close to the shore, while trawls and drift nets may target bass which are further out at sea, in feeding or pre-spawning aggregations. Anyway, it's obvious that these fish live too long, grow too slowly, migrate considerable distances, have erratic recruitment, and suffer too many human inroads to allow easy and effective management. Despite the difficulties, angling catches may give us clues about some of the shifts in numbers. It's hardly surprising after what I've said already that successions of good and poor year classes show up in rod catches. The two graphs on this slide display the fish caught from a few kilometres of Dorset shoreline over periods of several years by me and a number of my pals. The earlier one in 1980s clearly indicates the presence of a majority of fish weighing between 2 and 8 pounds, with quite a few that are even larger, while the lower graph about 40 years later shows a predominance of fish under 2 pounds in weight. Almost all these fish were taken by similar spinning tactics. To sum up, in terms of bass populations, the needs of the commercial and pleasure angling groups are not the same. To obtain the best return for their efforts, the netsmen require the largest number of saleable fish, while the pleasure anglers prefer the complete range of possible sizes. To delve back a bit further in time, we've got to look at the literature. A few anglers were writing about bass fishing in the early 20th century, and it's clear that the only tackle available to them at that time involved simple centerpin reels and crude twisted or plaited lines of flax or other fibres. Lures that are suitable for catching bass were available in the past, but casting them from the shore wasn't an option. Nevertheless, some large fish were caught using natural baits. In about the mid-20th century, fixed spool reels were developed, and with the introduction of monofilament nylon lines, lure fishing from the shore became viable. It was a few decades later that thinner, stronger braided lines made of fibres such as Kevlar rendered casting lightweight lures simple, and anybody could do it. These changes in fishing technology resulted in an explosion of hard-bodied, lightweight plugs and surface lures, which were later joined by lots of weedless soft plastic baits that are extremely effective for bass. More recently, the addition of circle hooks, which make it easy to catch and release bass for bait fishermen, has reduced the mortality of rod-caught fish from the shore even more. These tactics can also be used from small boats close inshore. So, having described the sort of current angling situation for bass, there are several related observations made over recent decades which might influence survival and growth. In the past, it was thought that only juvenile bass fed substantially on small prey such as amphipods and isopods, but we found that at times even large bass feed heavily on several species of Idatea, an isopod abundant in shallow water aggregations of drifting seaweeds. Similarly, the seaweed fly, called Silopa frigida, lays eggs in middens of weed cast up at the high water mark. On subsequent high tides, vast numbers of the tiny larvae of these flies form rafts on the surface of the sea, and they're devoured in quantity by both adult bass and mullet. Regarding recruitment, some years ago my pal Steve Pitts and I noticed that substantial numbers of young of the year bass lived in rock pools on the open shore. Considering the many kilometres of this type of shoreline around the country, it's possible that the relatively small number of recognised nursery areas in estuaries and lagoons might not be the only source of young bass in years when conditions are suitable for survival. In recent years, there have been several scares regarding marine life. The collapse of nesting colonies of seabirds is probably related to overfishing of bait fish such as sand eels, and this seems to be well documented. Since bass and other fish compete with the birds for food and are likely to be equally dependent on the small fish, it's probable that they're suffering even greater food-related population crashes, but nobody knows. Certainly, the major research and conservation groups seem to think that bass are seriously impacted. Lastly, I'd like to thank all the people who fished and discussed bass with me over the years, and particularly my pals who've often told me things that I didn't know. And finally, I'd like to apologise for being unable to attend today. I haven't gone fishing, honestly.